Two nations live on the edge. That's the title of today's video. But first, our joke, something to do with nukes. I don't get that one. You have to talk to Amber and Kimberly about that one. The key concepts for the day. What is the Soviets' response to NATO? And then what were U-2 planes used for? Followed up with who was Dwight D. Eisenhower. The key vocab for today, the Warsaw Pact, CIA, and Sputnik. And then what they did for us is they gave us a secondary list of vocabulary words that we should be familiar with as we listen to the rest of their topic. Moving on to the lesson. Today's video is about the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. Starting with the arms race, both countries drastically increased both the number of nuclear weapons both countries had and the destructive power of those weapons. The arms race started once the Soviet Union had exploded its first atomic bomb in 1949, which forced Truman into a very hard decision. He had to decide whether or not to make an even deadlier weapon than the atomic bomb. Many people argued over the morality of making an even deadlier weapon than the first nuclear weapon, but the United States started an arms race to see who could make the world's first hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb. On November 1st, 1952, the U.S. had exploded its first H-bomb, with the Soviets not far behind in developing theirs. They developed their first thermonuclear weapon in August of the same year. By this time, President Eisenhower was in office, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who was let me try that again. By this time, Eisenhower was president, and his Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. He was strongly against communism, believing that the Cold War was a moral crusade to stop the spread of communism. This view was shared by most Americans. Because of this willingness to stop communism by the United States, the U.S. teetered on the edge of an all-out nuclear war, otherwise known as brinkmanship. Under the constant fear of a real war, the U.S. trimmed its Army and Navy. The U.S. also expanded the Air Force and its buildup of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union soon followed suit. Fear of nuclear war and bombings became constant in American life for the next 30 years. As dependence on nuclear arms increased, Eisenhower's administration started to rely heavily on the CIA's intelligence. It was used to gather information from other countries, with the CIA first taking action in the Middle East with the issue of Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had put private Iranian industries under state control. To protest this action, Great Britain stopped buying oil from Iran. When the Iranian economy started to shake or become unstable, the U.S. feared Mossadegh might turn to the Soviets for money. In order to avoid this, the U.S. started paying anti-Mossadegh supporters to return the Shah to power. The Shah, who was pro-American, would give oil to Western non-communist countries. This plan succeeded. The CIA also took action in Guatemala in order to get rid of any communist government that might have been put into existence. The Guatemalan army did not comply with the U.S. orders to defend the president. When the Guatemalan army refused, their president resigned, and the leader of the army became the dictator of Guatemala. So we see the U.S. intelligence, the CIA, being used to fight communism in different ways. Okay. Though tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union were rising, their relationship seemed to thaw and get better once Stalin passed away in 1953. 1953. The Soviet Union then began to sew up loose ends and make peace with other nations. But when West Germany was allowed to rearm and join NATO, the Soviet Union grew fearful once more. So in order to combat this fear of the, in order to combat this fear, the Soviet Union formed its own military alliance with 7 other Eastern European countries, and this became called the Warsaw Pact. During the Geneva Summit in July of 1955, the U.S. put forth the Open Skies proposal to the Soviet Union. This proposal stated that the U.S. and the Soviets would allow flights over each other's territory in order to see if the other was agreeing to any arms agreement that might be reached. The Soviet Union rejected the proposal, not really wanting their military bases watched and possibly spied on by the CIA. This ironically led to the U-2 spy plane incident many years later. Even though the proposal failed, many consider the Geneva Summit as a step toward peace. Once Stalin died, the Soviet Union lacked a true leader for a short while until a man by the name of Nikita Khrushchev came to power. He believed, like Stalin, that communism would soon dominate the world, but unlike Stalin, believed that that communism taking over the world could happen peacefully. The space race soon started, and the Soviets got a big jump up on that October 4th, 1957, when they put the first artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth called Sputnik. Americans were shocked at being beaten in the early stages of the space race. America quickly began pouring a bunch of money into the space program, with U.S. scientists working madly to catch up to the Soviets. America's first attempt at launching a satellite was a complete failure, with the satellite falling over before it was even launched. The Americans regained their footing in the space race by successfully launching its second satellite in early 1958. Following the Soviets' rejection of Eisenhower's open skies policy, the CIA secretly began to make high-altitude flights over the Soviet Union territory with U-2 planes. By the 1960s, many U.S. officials were nervous about the U-2 program. The first reason was that U-2 flights were a well-known secret among the nation's press members. The second reason was that the Soviets had actually been aware of the flight since 1958 as well. Lastly, Eisenhower wanted the U-2 flights to end because he worried about the planes being shot down by the Soviets and ruining his effectiveness at keeping the peace, and basically avoiding nuclear war. So on May 1st, 1960, with some persuasion from Secretary of State Dulles, who was strongly against communism, mind you, they issued the last U-2 flight. The last flight ended horribly, as the plane was shot down. The plane was shot down 4 hours after it had entered Soviet airspace. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was forced to parachute to safety into Soviet-controlled territory. Powers was captured, charged with espionage or spying, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Once the U-2 plane spying was brought to light by the Soviets, Eisenhower denied that the flights actually existed. Khrushchev kept putting pressure on Eisenhower until he admitted that the U-2 flight missions were real. Khrushchev demanded an apology for the espionage and for Eisenhower to stop U-2 flights over Russia. Eisenhower gladly agreed to stop the U-2 plane flights. They had caused him enough trouble already, but he would not apologize for those flights. Angered by Eisenhower's actions, Khrushchev called upon the summit and withdrew Eisenhower's invitation to visit the Soviet Union. The U-2 spy plane incident only proved to increase tensions between the Soviets and the Americans instead of decreasing them. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.